Well, welcome to another edition of Traveling Through History. Tonight we have a very special episode for you, and it's on a topic that has fascinated me since I was a little boy, and that's about King Leonidas I of Sparta and his 300 Spartans who made the famous stand at the pass in Thermopylae. And they did it although knowing that they were sacrificing themselves for Sparta, they were sacrificing themselves for the rest of the Greek states. At the time, the Persian threat coming from the north was so great and so large that all the Greek states knew they had to work together, although over the centuries they had really been fighting quite a bit and at each other's throats most of the time. But this threat was so large, they all had to come together. And so he led the land force against Xerxes and Persia. This was actually the second invasion by Persia, 10 years after the first invasion had ended with a Greek victory at the Battle of Marathon, which is a very famous battle. And we'll do an episode about the Battle of Marathon in the future. Today, we're going to talk about King Leonidas I of Sparta, the incredible warrior and king he was. In Spartan days, the king was actually both the commander-in-chief, the military leader, the head general, and he was also the political leader. So he actually had both roles in that government. Leonidas was actually the third son of his father, who had two different wives. So it was a very unlikely path to kingdom for himself. And we'll talk about all the details of that, how he ended up ascending to the throne, even though he was the third son. And he became a very fearsome and amazing leader for Sparta, as many of the Spartan kings were. He had been trained as a military soldier through every type of skill set you would need to be a great Spartan soldier since he was 7 years old. Most of the boys had gone into early training at 7 or 8 years old, and he joined when he was 7. And so you could imagine the amount of skill he had built up over the years. When Leonidas left Sparta and said goodbye to his wife, said goodbye to his son, said goodbye to some of his other allies, knowing that he was not going to return, his wife famously said to him, come home with your shield or come home on your shield. And of course, he ended up coming home on his shield. So pretty amazing. This whole story is so legendary that it, of course, has inspired everyone in the centuries after, from military leaders to political leaders to even U.S. sports teams. As you know, many of our sports teams are named Spartans because of the inspiration that they've gotten from the Spartan story, Spartan valor, bravery, their military might, their military abilities, even though they were a very small city-state. And really, Leonidas really signifies all of those things to a T. And his bravery that he and his 300 men showed as they fronted about 7,000 total Greeks who were standing in the Thermopylae Pass to try to delay this Persian force that was coming. There was a historian at the time who was known to embellish, who said that there were something like 2.5 million Persian soldiers they were facing. But historians since then think it was much, much less. It was probably more like 250 or 300,000 Persians. But bottom line is they were outnumbered by about 30 to 1. And it was quite a 3 days that they were facing. They knew that they were terribly outnumbered and that all they were trying to do was a holding action and trying to delay the inevitable, which was eventually the Persians were going to slaughter all of them and then move into the rest of Greece. But they just wanted to buy the city-states just that little extra time to organize, to get their troops together, and it ended up working. The Persians, although they did go take several of the big cities, including Athens, eventually were kicked out by the Greeks some years later because they were able to get organized. So the Spartans achieved their objective, and it was an incredible sacrifice that Leonidas and his men did. So tonight we're going to talk to you all about Leonidas, about the Spartans, about this incredible battle at Thermopylae, which is the very narrow pass in northeastern Greece, chosen specifically because they knew they were going to be tremendously outnumbered. But the pass was so narrow that it allowed them to nullify and work against the tremendous numbers that the Persians had. They could essentially take this narrow pass and put their men across it and create a phalanx formation, which we'll talk some more about the details of phalanx. which was incredibly effective. And they were able to hold off the Persians for a number of days. They were able to inflict tremendous damage on the Persians and tremendous casualties. Xerxes, the king of Persia, was watching from up above from his throne during these 3 days and was getting more and more agitated, more and more angry, and even fired some of his top generals, even had a couple of them hung because they weren't getting the job done against the Greeks. And he was just so furious that he didn't know what to do. He also was in awe in some ways of Leonidas. Although he was angry, he also was admiring his work and admiring what a great general he was in front leading his men. He actually, on day 3, made an overture to Leonidas when there was a break in the action and asked if Leonidas would consider a truce and would consider coming on board with Persia, and he would give him anything he wanted, from territory to resources to anything else, thinking that maybe Leonidas would take it. But instead he refused and said, you're going to have to come take me and my weapons and my men. So again, a very brave gesture there, did not take the easy way. So we're going to talk about the history. We're going to show a series of 2 brief videos, which we'll talk about on the other side. And then, of course, as always, we'll talk about the 25 little known facts about King Leonidas and the 300 Spartans. So let's go ahead and get into it. So King Leonidas I was born 540 BC and died 11th of August 480 BC, which, of course, that was the 3rd day of the Battle at Thermopylae. He was king of the ancient Greek city-state of Sparta, and he was the son of King Anaxandridas, who was the 17th king of the Agiad dynasty, a Spartan royal house which claimed descent from the mythical demigod Heracles, or some people call him Hercules. Leonidas I ascended to the throne in 489 BC, succeeding his half-brother Cleomenes. He ruled jointly along with King Leotychidas until his death in 480 BC, when he was succeeded by his son Pleistarchus, and Pleistarchus was his only son at the time. Interestingly enough, as you heard there, Leonidas, he was co-king with Leotychidas, which was very common back then. The Spartans, because of their need to constantly protect themselves and be at war all the time, protecting their territory, often would have 2 kings that would be almost like co-kings, one of them more militaristic, one of them more administrative in running the city itself. At the Second Greco-Persian War, Leonidas led the allied Greeks' forces in a last stand at the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC, attempting to defend the pass from the invading Persian army, and was killed early during the 3rd and last day of the battle. Leonidas entered myth as a hero and the leader of the 300 Spartans who also died in the battle. While the Greeks lost this battle, they were able to expel the Persian invaders in the following year. So they were able to get themselves organized enough to expel them again for the 2nd time. Of course, 10 years before this, as I mentioned, the Greek city-states had faced Xerxes' father, who had invaded Greece for the first time. That was the First Greco-Persian War. He also had been expelled at the Battle of Marathon. So 2 times Greece was able to defend their territory. Leonidas' mother was not only his father's wife, but he was also his father's niece, and had been barren for so long that the local leaders, who annually elected administrators of the Spartan constitution, tried to talk King Anaxandridas to set her aside and take another wife. He refused, claiming his wife was blameless, wherein the leaders agreed to allow him to take a 2nd wife without setting aside his first wife. So his 2nd wife, the descendant of Cleomenes of Sparta, promptly bore a son, Cleomenes. However, 1 year after Cleomenes' birth, Anaxandridas' first wife also gave birth to a son, Dorius, and then gave birth to 2 additional sons. One was Leonidas, and the 2nd son was his twin, Cleombrotus. Leonidas' name comes from descendant of Leon. So you can see Leonidas was 3rd in line to the throne, and so most assumed that he would never make it to the throne. So Cleomenes, as we mentioned earlier, was his older brother from a different mother. and he assumed to the kingdom after his father died. And Leonidas continued to work with the military, became one of their top generals, and was a very prominent figure in Spartan culture, and essentially took orders from his brother, who was the king at the time. And then, surprisingly, when Cleomenes died, he left Leonidas with his kingdom in his 40s. He actually was about 42 years old, they believe, when he took over as king. And Dorius was incredibly outraged, which was one of his half-brothers, that he found it impossible to remain in Sparta, and left and sailed away and ended up going to Far East Asia somewhere. So they gave this kingdom over to Leonidas III in line, and he immediately took over, and he ended up marrying the daughter of his brother Cleomenes, and her name was Gorgo. So pretty ironic that his father married his niece, and then Leonidas married his niece. And they got married around 490 BC, and he ascended to the throne. Leonidas was heir to the Agiad throne, which was an actual throne that was very sought after in Spartan culture. Likewise, he was a full citizen when the Persians sought submission from Sparta and met with vehement rejection in 492. Plutarch wrote, when someone said to him, except for being king, you are not a superior to us, Leonidas, son of Anaxandridas and brother of Cleomenes, said, but were I not better than you, I should not be king. The product of the Agiad, Leonidas was unlikely to have been referring to his royal blood alone, but rather suggesting that, like his brother Dorius, he had proved himself superior in the competitive environment of Spartan training and society, thus making him qualified to rule as king. Leonidas was chosen to lead the combined Greek forces determined to resist the second Persian invasion of Greece, which happened in 481 BC. This was not simply a tribute to Spartans' military prowess. The probability that the coalition wanted Leonidas personally for his capability as a military leader is underlined by the fact that just 2 years after his death, the coalition preferred Athenian leadership to the leadership of either Leonidas or Leonidas' successor, Pausanias. The rejection of his son and Pausanias was not a reflection on Spartan arms. Spartan's military reputation had never stood in higher regard, nor was Sparta less powerful in 478 BC than it had been in 481 BC. The selection of Leonidas to lead the defense of Greece against Xerxes' invasion led to Leonidas' death. The selection of Leonidas to lead the defense in Greece against Xerxes' invasion led to Leonidas' death in the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC, as we mentioned. In terms of the Battle of Thermopylae itself, upon receiving a request from the Confederated Greek forces to aid in defending Greece against the Persian invasion, Sparta consulted the oracle at Delphi. The oracle is said to have made the following prophecy: for you, inhabitants of wide-wayed Sparta, either your great and glorious city must be wasted by the Persian men, or if not that, then the bound of Lacedaemon must mourn a dead king from Heracles' line. The might of bulls or lions will not restrain him with opposing strength, for he has the might of Zeus. I declare that he will not be restrained until he utterly tears apart the Persians. So this was the oracle's prophecy, essentially, and the Spartans took it very seriously. So did Leonidas. He realized he was going to die at the front of his troops, but he was going to do it after delaying the Persians and after inflicting a tremendous cost on them. In August 480 BC, Leonidas marched out of Sparta to meet Xerxes' army at Thermopylae with a small force of 1,200 men, 900 helots, and helots back then were slaves, and 300 Spartan hoplites. Hoplites were essentially their very elite troops, almost like our special forces today, where he was joined by forces from other Greek city-states as well, who put themselves under his command to form an army of 7,000 strong. There were various theories on why Leonidas was accompanied by such a small force of hoplites. According to Herodotus, the Spartans sent the men with Leonidas on ahead so that the rest of the allies would see them and march with no fear of defeat. Instead of siding with the Persians like the others, were doing a delaying action. After completing their festival, the Carnea, they left their garrison at Sparta and marched at full force towards Thermopylae. The rest of the allies planned to do likewise, for the Olympiad coincided with these events. They accordingly sent their advance guard, not expecting the war at Thermopylae to be decided so quickly. Many modern commentators are dissatisfied with the explanation and the point to the fact that the Olympic Games were in progress or impute internal dissent and intrigue. Whatever the reason, Sparta's own contribution was just 300 Spartans. The total force assembled to defend the pass of Thermopylae came to something between 4,000 and 7,000 Greeks. They faced a Persian army who had invaded from the north of Greece under Xerxes I. Herodotus stated that this army consisted of over 2 million men. Modern scholars consider this to be a huge exaggeration and give estimates to be between 100,000 and 300,000, and probably closer to 300,000. Xerxes waited 4 days to attack, hoping the Greeks would disperse. Finally, on the 5th day, the Persians attacked. Leonidas and the Greeks repulsed the Persians' frontal attacks during the 5th and 6th days, killing roughly 10,000 of the enemy troops. The Persian elite unit, known to the Greeks as the Immortals, was held back, and 2 of Xerxes' brothers died in the battle. So his 2 younger brothers died in the battle at the hands of Leonidas. On the 7th day, on August 11th, a Greek traitor named Ephraites led the Persian general Hydarnes by a mountain trek to rear the Greeks. At that point, Leonidas sent away most of the Greek troops and remained at the pass with his 300 Spartans, 900 helots, 400 Thebans, and 700 Thespians. The Thespians stayed entirely at their own will, declaring that they would not abandon Leonidas and his followers. The leader for the Thespians was Diaphilus, son of Diodromes, and as Herodotus writes, hence they lived with the Spartans and died with the Spartans. One theory provided by Herodotus is that Leonidas sent away the remainder of his men because he cared about their safety. The king would have thought it wise to preserve these Greek troops for future battles against the Persians, but he knew that the Spartans could never abandon their post on the battlefield. The soldiers who stayed behind were to protect their escape against the Persian cavalry. Herodotus believed that Leonidas gave the order because he perceived the allies to be disheartened, unwilling to encounter danger, and he had made his mind up he was staying. He therefore chose to dismiss all troops except for the Thebans, Thespians, the Helots, and his 300 Spartans. For this small Greek force, which was attacked on both sides, all were killed except for the 400 Thebans, who surrendered to Xerxes without a fight. When Leonidas was killed, the Spartans retrieved his body after driving back the Persians 4 times. Herodotus says Xerxes' orders were to have Leonidas' head cut off and put on a stake, and his body crucified, which was considered sacrilegious. In terms of his legacy, there's become a hero cult around Leonidas now and his 300 Spartans, which still survives to today, as we mentioned. There are still many solemnities celebrated every year in the Spartan region of Greece in honor of Leonidas and his Spartans. So even today, they're having festivals every year about him. Contest was held opposite the theater of Sparta, where there are 2 monuments of Pausanias and Leonidas. You can still see those today if you visit. So that's a little bit about Leonidas, the 300 Spartans, the Battle of Thermopylae. Gives you a real good sense for how brave he was, how brave his men were. They knew they were sacrificing themselves, all for the purpose of delaying the Persian advance so that the rest of the Greek city-states could organize, unite, and eventually expel the Persians a year later. So let's go ahead and take a look at this series of 2 videos, and then we'll come back and talk about it on the other side.
The Persian Empire had been defeated by the Greeks in the Battle of Marathon, but Emperor Darius sought revenge and began to assemble the greatest army that the old world had seen up to that point. But several uprisings within the Persian Empire postponed these plans. With the perishing of Emperor Darius, his son Xerxes assumed power and asphyxiated the rebellions in his empire, and now the emperor was free to move in motion his father's plans. 10 years had passed since his defeat at Marathon, but now the Persians had their mammoth army geared towards Greece. Under the command of Xerxes, a floating bridge connecting Asia to Europe was built so that the colossal Persian army could cross the Strait of the Dardanelles. At the army's vanguard, emissaries demanded the submission of Greek cities to the Persian Empire, being spared if they were accepted. The emissaries demanded from the Greeks an offering of land and water. After having heard what the emissaries had to say, the Spartans threw them into the pit and said they could have as much water as they wanted from down there. The Greeks gathered in the city of Corinth and constituted a great alliance in order to attempt to stop the Persian advance. The Athenians, commanded by Themistocles, would use their powerful fleet to fight the Persians by sea, whereas Leonidas, the king of Sparta, would lead the land troops and try to halt the Persians at the gates of fire at Thermopylae. But the city of Sparta was celebrating Carnea, a religious feast which forbade belligerent activities during its course. Leonidas consulted the oracle of Delphi, which told him that only a sacrifice of a legitimate heir to the throne of Hercules could detain the fury of the son of Perseus. According to Greek mythology, the hero Perseus had many descendants. Some of them had been the sprout of the people later known as Persians. On the other hand, Hercules' descendants ruled Sparta for several centuries already, and so Leonidas realized that his fate was to march against Xerxes. Unable to take his whole army with him, Leonidas handpicked 300 elite soldiers as his personal guard. On his way, he kept adding soldiers from other Greek cities. It is estimated that Leonidas managed to assemble an army of 7,000 soldiers from different backgrounds and led it toward the cliff of Thermopylae. The Spartans positioned themselves near the gates of fire, a strip of the cliff that was so narrow that the numerical superiority of the Persian army would be curbed. The gigantic Persian army was getting near, with more than 300,000 soldiers. Xerxes sent an emissary to meet the Spartan king. Xerxes proposed to Leonidas a unification between the Spartans and the Persians so that they could rule the whole of Greece under the flagship of the Persian Empire. The Spartan king rejected Xerxes' proposal, and his emissary threatened him. "Our arrows are so numerous that they will cover the whole sky." "Even better. We will fight in the shadows." The battle began, and the mighty Persian cavalry was borderline useless due to the wall of spears of the Greek phalanxes and the narrow room they had to move their units. The pouring of arrows was intense, but the Greek shields made the attack ineffective. The Persians had no alternative but to send their infantry for one-on-one combat. The outstanding phalanx formed by the Spartans repelled the waves of Persians' attacks, even defeating the division of Persian elite soldiers known as the Immortals. Xerxes was being humiliated by a couple of Greeks. The Greek strategy was working amazingly, but the Spartans were betrayed by a Greek called Ephialtes, who told the Persians about the routes used by shepherds, which would give them the chance to bypass the Greek defense. Realizing that they would end up surrounded, Leonidas freed the remaining Greek soldiers to retreat in order to prevent a massacre. Leonidas, his loyal Spartan soldiers, and about 1,000 Greeks readied themselves for the final battle. The Greeks fought bravely, but could not prevent the massacre that followed. After the end of the battle, Xerxes impaled Leonidas' head in a stake and marched victoriously towards Athens. The Persian victory represented a high cost in terms of lives and resources, allowing the Athenians to have 7 days to prepare themselves for the upcoming battle. Leonidas and his 300 Spartans became martyrs. Their heroic feats are still studied and celebrated.
Leonidas the Warrior. Leonidas was the king of Sparta during the 5th century BC. He was the son of King Anaxandridas II and his first wife, and the half-brother of King Cleomenes I. He was also the husband of Queen Gorgo, the daughter of King Cleomenes I. Together, they had a son, Pleistarchus. The Spartans were an ancient Greek society of warriors who were known for their fierce and disciplined military culture. They were known for their strict military training, which began at a young age and continued throughout adulthood. The Spartan army was considered to be one of the most formidable fighting forces of the ancient world. Spartans were known for their physical fitness, athleticism, and military prowess. As a Spartan, Leonidas had gone through rigorous training as a hoplite, a type of heavily armored infantrymen who fought in the phalanx formation. All Spartan boys needed to enter the agoge, which was a state-sponsored education and training program, at the age of 7. This training included learning how to fight with a spear and a large shield, and how to maneuver in a wall formation with other hoplites. Leonidas received even more rigorous training in military tactics, strategy, and leadership. He was trained in different forms of combat, such as hand-to-hand, weapons, and military tactics. As a result of the rigorous training, Leonidas was a highly skilled and experienced hoplite by the time he became king. Succession to the throne. After the untimely death of his father, Leonidas was chosen as king by the Spartan assembly, known as the Apella. The Apella was made up of Spartan citizens and was responsible for electing Spartan kings and other important government officials. Leonidas was chosen to be king due to his military experience and leadership skills, as well as his royal lineage. It's important to note that in Sparta, the king is chosen based on military and leadership skills. Battle of Marathon. Ancient Greece was a group of many city-states where Athens and Sparta became the most influential and dominant among them. Despite the competition amongst these city-states for territory and resources, they formed alliances to protect themselves from external invasions. One such event was the Battle of Marathon, when these united city-states of Greece defeated the powerful Persian army. The Battle of Marathon was fought in 490 BC. The Persian army, led by King Darius I, had invaded Greece in an attempt to conquer the city-states. Athenians chose a narrow plain where the Persian cavalry would not be able to maneuver effectively. The battle began with a stalemate as the two sides engaged in a prolonged spear fight. However, the Athenians were able to break through the Persian line, and the Persians began to retreat. The Athenians then launched a pursuit, which ended with the Persians being forced to flee back to their ships. Athenians were able to inflict heavy casualties on the Persians, and they were forced to retreat to Asia Minor. It was the first time that a heavily armed Persian army was defeated by a small Greek force, and it helped to establish the Greeks as a dominant military power in the region. Battle of Thermopylae. The Battle of Thermopylae was fought in 480 BC between an alliance of Greek city-states led by King Leonidas of Sparta and the Persian Empire led by King Xerxes. It took place at the narrow pass of Thermopylae, located in northeastern Greece, which controlled access to southern Greece. The Persian army, which was much larger and better equipped than the Greek force, began the battle by attempting to force their way through the pass. However, the Greeks, who were heavily armed hoplites, were able to hold their ground and repel the Persian attack. The Persians then tried to outflank the Greeks by sending a force to attack the pass from the rear, but the Greeks were able to repel this attack as well. For 3 days, the Greeks were able to hold off the Persian army, despite being vastly outnumbered. Bravery of Leonidas and the 300 Spartans. The bravery of Leonidas and the 300 Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae is considered legendary in history. Despite being vastly outnumbered by the Persian army, they were able to hold the pass of Thermopylae for 3 days, significantly delaying the Persian advance into Greece. During the battle, the Spartans fought in a tight formation, known as a phalanx, using their shields and spears to repel the Persian attacks. They fought with fierce determination and discipline, never faltering or breaking formation, and never giving up despite heavy casualties. Leonidas, in particular, is remembered for his bravery and leadership during the battle. He is said to have personally led the Spartan warriors into battle and to have fought with great skill and courage. He also demonstrated strong leadership by deciding to remain in the narrow pass with a small force to hold the Persians off while the rest of the Greek army could retreat and regroup. Death of Leonidas and the 300 Spartans. On the fourth day, a resident named Ephialtes betrayed the Greeks by showing the Persians a mountain path that would allow them to outflank the Greek position. The Persians used this path to attack the Greeks from the rear, and the Greeks were forced to retreat. Although the Greeks were ultimately defeated, the battle was considered a significant victory for them. The Greeks were able to inflict heavy casualties on the Persians and delay their advance into Greece, giving the other Greek city-states time to prepare for the next battle. Leonidas and the 300 Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae is also remembered as an act of selfless heroism, as they knew their sacrifice would allow the other Greek city-states to prepare for the next battle and ultimately defeat the Persian army. The battle also established the heroic status of Leonidas and the 300 Spartans, who fought and died there as they held the pass for 3 days against a much larger Persian army. The Battle of Thermopylae is considered one of the most iconic battles in history due to the heroism and sacrifice of the Greek warriors who fought there. Revenge of Leonidas. Despite the sacrifice of Leonidas and his 300 Spartan hoplites at the Battle of Thermopylae, the Persians were still able to move down the Greek coast and into Boeotia. However, the Athenian navy's victory at the Battle of Salamis in September 480 BC marked a turning point in the Persian Wars, and the Persians were forced to retreat and return home. Nevertheless, Leonidas' actions served as a demonstration of Sparta's willingness to make the ultimate sacrifice for the protection of the Greek region. 40 years after the battle, the remains of Leonidas, or what were believed to be his remains, were retrieved, and a shrine was built in his honor near the site of his burial. The sacrifice and bravery of Leonidas at Thermopylae earned him lasting fame and reverence in ancient Greece. This is what really happened to Leonidas.
So as you can see, a lot of amazing things out of those videos. The first one is the mention, as I talked about earlier in the program, about the Spartan military training that started with boys at 7 years old, and that happened to Leonidas as well. He went into his military training at 7 years old. He became such a skilled warrior at a young age that at 12 years old, he actually entered a special military officer training program, because they knew he was going to be on officer track. And obviously he had royal blood as well. So very important that if you're in the royal line that you become a warrior in the Spartan culture. So that was interesting. And then you saw a lot of incredible scenes there from the movie 300 with Gerard Butler, the actor who plays King Leonidas, and does a fantastic job. If you haven't seen that movie, I would highly recommend it if you're a war aficionado. It is a very violent movie, I'll warn you about that, but if you do like war movies, it's incredibly filmed. It's visually stunning. Some of the slow motion scenes that they do really are incredible. The way they filmed it was really quite legendary, and actually there's been several sequels since about some of the follow-on battles that happened after Leonidas died. Some other things in that video, you saw the mention about the Battle of Marathon that had happened 10 years earlier with Xerxes' father from Persia, Darius, who had invaded Greece and ended up getting stopped and defeated at the Battle of Marathon and then expelled from the country. They ended up having to get back on their ships and sail back to East Asia, and then had to sail back to their country in Persia. And so you see then 10 years later, the Battle of Thermopylae, when Darius's son Xerxes comes to get revenge of his father to invade Greece for the second time. In the Second Greco-Persian War. Some other things you saw there, some of the other things that were pretty stunning was not just the incredible bravery of Leonidas and his men, but that he did something very unselfish. He asked most of the men to retreat and go back to their city-states after he realized that they were about to be encircled by the Persians, and kept only his hardcore Spartan 300 and some of the other volunteers to stay, which I think was incredible, not just a sacrifice on his part, but he probably realized that those other Greek troops could go back home and reunite with the troops that were preparing for the major invasion and fight another day. So I thought that was pretty big of him to do that. Again, just pointing out some of the other things in the video there, how visually stunning these battles were. As you saw in both the Battle of Marathon and Thermopylae, the Greeks did a very smart thing. They chose the ground of their choosing. They chose ground that was advantageous to their smaller numbers. and their better tactics. So they allowed them to use the phalanx formation, as they talked about in the video and that we talked about earlier in the program, in addition to maximizing their smaller numbers compared to these massive forces that were coming in. So very smart in both cases. They did really, really well in these battles against incredible odds. So that's a little bit about those two videos. Hopefully, if you are a war movie fan, you'll take a look at the movie 300 if you haven't seen it already with Gerard Butler. It is really fantastic. And there's so much to learn in terms of Leonidas and the Spartan 300 and all the things we can take from their bravery and incredible sacrifice that day. So let's go ahead and take a look at the 25 interesting facts about King Leonidas and the Spartan 300. Number 1, Leonidas I became king by chance. Leonidas was born on Spartan territory in the Peloponnesian Peninsula in southern Greece around 530 to 520 BC. He was the son of the Spartan king Anaxandridas and was descended from the Greek cult hero Heracles or Hercules. However, during his youth and early manhood, Leonidas could not have expected to become king because the firstborn and only child of Anaxandridas' second union was male, and that was Cleomenes, who became the heir to the throne. In the meantime, the first wife conceived 3 sons, Dorius, Leonidas, and Cleombrotus, respectively. So there were 4 sons total. Leonidas was last in line. Dorius and Cleombrotus both sailed and settled elsewhere because they didn't want to live under the rule of Cleomenes. So when Cleomenes died suddenly, Leonidas ascended to the throne unexpectedly. You can imagine what a surprise that was for him. You see some epic pictures there of Leonidas later in life as a soldier and what he would look like in his full armor and equipment. Number 2, this is Sparta, a quote by King Leonidas in the epic movie 300, which we just talked about. The Battle of Thermopylae, a battle which has inspired Western admiration ever since it happened. We've seen it recreated in the graphic novel by Frank Miller, which turned into the extremely popular movie 300 by Zack Snyder. This was the Battle of Thermopylae, a moment which came to define the struggles of the Greek city-states in their wars against the vast Persian Empire. Even though it wasn't a victory, it was used to hold up the heroism, endurance, and sacrifice of the 300 Spartans, who fell holding off hundreds of thousands of Persians for 3 days. But how much of this story has been fictionalized by the legend? What really happened at Thermopylae? Was it as important as has been made out to be? You can see some really epic pictures there from the movie 300 and also the book that we mentioned by Frank Miller. Really an excellent book. Number 3, truth or fiction. The primary source for the Battle of Thermopylae comes from an ancient Greek historian, Herodotus. And we mentioned this in the lead up of the program, and also it was mentioned in the video about Herodotus. He was also known as the father of history for Greece. You see a statue of Herodotus there on the bottom left. To be fair, he was also called the father of lies for his tendency to also report on stories that were largely fictional, as well as for his large exaggerations. Modern historians have had to take Herodotus' comments with a grain of salt in search of the truth, as opposed to his idea of a better story. See a couple epic pictures there of the Spartans as they were marching into Thermopylae in that very narrow pass, and then the actual battle itself. Number 4, other historical accounts. So other ancient sources commented on the Battle of Thermopylae, including an account from Sicilian historian Diodorus Siculus, whose own account was derived from the previous document on Thermopylae from the Greek historian Ephorus. The account is mostly consistent with the claims made by Herodotus. Aside from that, the battle is mentioned by such historians as Plutarch and Tzetzes of Cnidus. You see one of the books there that's a historical account of what happened at the Battle of Thermopylae, and it really tells a lot of detail about what happened in all 3 days of the battle. You see a great statue there to Leonidas himself that's actually on the site there today, and they believe that his bones were actually buried just below that. Number 5, Thermopylae meaning. The name Thermopylae translates to hot gates in original Greek. This name was given to the narrow pass because of the warm sulfur springs which originated there. According to Greek myths, the mighty warrior Heracles was tricked into putting on clothes which had been soaked in the blood of Hydra. He was unable to take the clothes off, and they began boiling him alive. When he jumped into the waters to cool himself down, the poison actually heated up the water and made it toxic, creating the sulfurous springs that gave the pass its name. And you can see on the left side there is a recreation of what they think that pass looked like that day. And you can see how narrow it was. And so you can imagine 300 Spartans out front and then 7,000 Greeks behind them, and then coming at them, hundreds of thousands of Persians, all fighting in this very small area, many of them getting pushed off into the sea during the battle. And you can see in this center middle, that's what Thermopylae actually looks like today. And you can see it's much wider than it was back then. It's still pretty narrow though, but it's definitely wider than it would have been back then. And you see a picture there of Heracles battling Hydra, Hydra being the sea octopus that also had snakes on its ends and was poisonous. Number 6, Xerxes Revenge. And that's a picture on the top right of what Xerxes looks like in the movie 300. Pretty epic, this guy. He had all these jewelries and piercings and everything, and he was really a pretty bad guy. In around 480 BC, the Persian king Xerxes launched a massive land and sea invasion of Greece to avenge his father's own failed invasion, which itself had only been launched when he had tried to subdue the Ionian Greeks in Asia Minor. The Ionians had gotten support from other Greek city-states such as Athens and Sparta and repelled the Persians, irking the empire and leading to the Greco-Persian Wars, which lasted half a century. So over 50 years, the Persians were trying to invade Greece because of this one slight by the Ionians. You can see a picture there on the bottom of what it must have looked like to the very small number of Greeks and this massive Persian force that had come against it. Number 7, Xerxes tried diplomacy at first, and we mentioned this a little bit, and it was also mentioned in the video, that while stories paint Xerxes as a cruel, bloodthirsty tyrant, the Persian king at least tried to go the diplomatic route at first. His terms were fairly acceptable. The Greeks would still have their freedom. They would simply need to take the title Friends of the Persian People. Xerxes even offered them the chance to settle on land that was far more fertile than what they had possessed in Sparta, if they would just give up their cities. But Leonidas was cut from different cloth. When he heard Xerxes' offer, his response was quite literally legendary. Leonidas refused Xerxes' offer of friendship, so Xerxes gave him a second offer. He sent Leonidas a simple message: hand over your arms. Leonidas' response was just as iconic: come and take them. And that's actually one of the best lines in the movie as well. And you can see on the bottom left there, that's Leonidas actually shouting those words, come and take them. And you see Xerxes making the offer to him on the top left. Number 8, Persian messengers thrown into a well. In the movie 300, one of the iconic scenes of the film was a scene where Persian messengers demand a gift of earth and water from the Spartans. In response, Leonidas and his men cast the messengers into a well. According to Herodotus, this did actually happen, but this actually occurred during the first invasion of Greece by Xerxes' father, Darius I, long before Leonidas was king of Sparta. So, Hollywood always takes a little bit of liberty with the stories. And you can see on the top left, there is an artist rendering of this event of the Spartans throwing the messenger from Xerxes down into the well. And there's this scene there on the center middle of Leonidas kicking the messenger into the well. Well, if they had been historically accurate, of course, this occurred actually 10 years before what was portrayed in the movie. Number 9, how many Persians were at Thermopylae? According to Herodotus, the Persian forces numbered no fewer than 2.5 million men, and also accompanied by an equivalent number of support personnel. Not surprisingly, modern historians strongly dispute the idea of 5 million people. somehow being fed and watered during this battle, including horses and other animals. Ctesias reported a humbler estimate of 800,000 people making up the total invasion force, but even this is considered an exaggeration. Modern estimates have put the Persian forces at 300,000 with 100,000 support personnel. Either way, King Leonidas and the 300 Spartans were heavily outnumbered, as we mentioned. You can see some epic pictures there of what it would look like with 300,000 Persians coming at you. Number 10, how many Greeks were at Thermopylae to back up the 300 Spartans? There's a lot of dispute over the number of Greek soldiers who defended the pass at Thermopylae and backed up the Spartan 300. Herodotus claimed it was between 5,200 and 6,100. According to Diodorus Siculus, it was around 7,400 Greeks who fought the Persians. Still other accounts had the number close to 9,000. Whatever the number was, they were outnumbered by the Persians by close to 30 to 1 and were destined to all die over the course of the 3-day battle. See a couple other epic pictures there from this battle and the Greeks doing their incredible formations that were so successful, especially the phalanx formation. Number 11, Persians at Thermopylae were led by the Immortals. And you can see a picture on the top left there of what they portrayed the Immortals to look like in the movie 300 that I mentioned. And then on the right there is a picture of what an artist's rendering would be, what they really looked like back then, the Immortals. The Immortals being the elite troops for Xerxes, very similar to the 300 Spartan troops who were the elite troops from Sparta. Among the many units in the Persian army, the elite troops were the ones whom the Greeks called the Persian Immortals. This unit, described by Herodotus as heavy infantry, were supposedly known as Immortals because for every one of their members that was killed, lost, or incapacitated, a replacement was immediately brought in. This way, the Immortals never numbered more or less than 10,000 warriors. So pretty incredible, this force that Xerxes had assembled as his elite fighting force. And yet still the Spartans repelled them. Number 12, our King Leonidas I for our kingdom. When word got out the advancing Persian army headed towards Greece, the Spartans sent an envoy to the oracle at Delphi. And you can see on the top left there, that is a picture of Delphi today, what it looks like, the ruins. And the oracle of Delphi was a very famous prognosticator there. And they sent a message to him to find out whether they should march out to fight the Persians. The oracle is said to have answered that the Spartans must mourn the loss of a king, or else their glorious town shall be sacked. After this prophecy, King Leonidas and the Spartans led a coalition of Greek city-states to Thermopylae to defend the pass as long as they could, while Sparta and Athens and others prepared for the larger fight. Leonidas was well aware he and his men would be a sacrifice to delay the Persian army. And you can see a picture there on the top right of Sparta and what it looked like and what some of the incredible ruins look like today of the Spartan village. Number 13, King Leonidas I was an old man at Thermopylae, contrary to what 300 might have told you, and that's the movie. And as you saw, Gerard Butler was in an amazing shape in that movie. King Leonidas was not a young man in his prime as portrayed in the movie. According to historical sources, Leonidas was said to have been an aging man at the Battle of Thermopylae, in his late 50s or maybe as old as 60 years old. The fact that he was so old and still fighting Persians to the death makes his story even more impressive than it would if he was a young man, and maybe a little harder to cast in an epic war movie. Historians believe his old age is one reason he himself was willing to go fight to his death with his top group of fighting men, knowing his time on the throne was coming to an end. You see some epic pictures there of Leonidas and what he might have looked like as a upper 50s or 60-year-old man on the battlefield and still getting it done. Number 14, prepared to die and pass on to a new generation. Of the 300 Spartans that accompanied Leonidas to Thermopylae, the Spartan king made sure that he brought only men with living sons who could continue their family lines. It was very important in Spartan society that sons were living to carry on the family and to protect Sparta for the future generations. Boys in Sparta began physical training and sparring exercises at 7 years old and were trained for battle their entire lives, typically joining the military in active duty at 16 or 17. And you see some incredible pictures there, both artist renderings and also some scenes from the movie 300, showing these young boys being put into training sessions and training schools to be ready for future battles to protect Sparta. Number 15, important battle at sea. While the Battle of Thermopylae was happening on land, the Battle of Artemisium was being fought on the sea. The combined Greek fleets met the much larger Persian fleet, and they were outnumbered 3-1. And that battle was fought between an alliance of Greek city-states, including Sparta, Athens, Corinth, and others, against the Persian Empire of Xerxes I. And that was an incredible fleet that the Greeks had put together, even though they were outnumbered 3-1. But most of the ships, about 80% of the ships, were from Athens. Athens was much more of a seafaring and naval city in terms of their forces. Both sides suffered heavy losses, and the Greeks fought valiantly and sunk more Persian ships than they lost. The Athenian general Themistocles proposed that the allied Greeks block the advance of the Persian army at the pass of Thermopylae and simultaneously block the Persian navy at the Straits of Artemisium. An allied naval force of 271 triremes, and on the bottom left there you see what a trireme used to look like, was thus dispatched to await the arrival of the Persians. In the end, the Persians were too much, and the Greeks sailed off after 3 days with only half their ships intact. You see some of the incredible battle scenes that were happening between the Greek city-states and the Persians on the open seas. Number 16, marital discussions between Leonidas and his wife Gorgo. And you see a picture there on the top left of the actress who played Gorgo in the movie, talking to Gerard Butler, her husband. Queen Gorgo eventually married Leonidas, his second wife, and he was her step-uncle and much older than she was. Leonidas succeeded to the Spartan throne in 490 BC. Herodotus claims that Gorgo was the reason he was able to do so, as she inherited Cleomenes' property upon his death and gave Leonidas greater claim to the throne. According to Plutarch, Leonidas was asked by his wife Gorgo what she should do if Leonidas did not return from the Battle of Thermopylae. He is said to have replied to her, "Marry a good man and have good children." Leonidas loved his wife very much, and she had given him a son who he ascended to the throne after him, King Pleistarchus. So he really did love her very much, but he was essentially releasing her because he knew he was going to die on the battlefield. Number 17, Xerxes could not believe that they weren't winning the battle decisively. On the first day of fighting, the Persians initially sent arrows at the Greeks, and when that failed to defeat them, a wave of Medes and Scythians struck the front lines, only for the Persian Immortals themselves to be sent forward when all else failed. So many men were said to have died on the first day that Xerxes, who was observing the battle from a throne they set up for him up above, jumped out of his seat 3 times in astonishment. 20,000 Persians were killed on day one, along with 2,000 Greeks and 100 of the 300 Spartans. The Greeks actually had more men than necessary to guard the pass effectively. This proved advantageous as they could rotate men in and out of the pass to prevent fatigue from leading to more deaths than necessary. Also, in order to keep luring the Persians to further slaughter, the Greek soldiers would allegedly pretend to retreat. When the Persians charged forward, the Greeks would turn around and reform the line and then slaughter the Persians. See a couple great pictures there of Xerxes sitting on his throne, looking down at the naval and land battles. And he was just in amazement that the Greeks were putting up such a fight. In the movie, it's pretty interesting. There's some scenes of them carrying Xerxes around on this throne, multiple men down below carrying him around and putting him down wherever he wanted to sit. Number 18, Spartans and other Greeks were supported by slaves. One popular belief that people have embraced about the Greeks at Thermopylae is the fact that the Greeks were fighting for their freedom against the Persian despot who enslaved various people to fight for him. However, the militaristic Spartans were famously masters of an entire enslaved class of people known as helots, who performed all the menial tasks of keeping the Spartan economy and systems functioning while giving the Spartan citizens the ability to be career soldiers. Around 900 helots were said to have accompanied the 300 Spartans to the Battle of Thermopylae, staying behind with them in the fight to the death in support by managing the food and the weapons and the gear, and all of them were said to have died in the 3-day battle as well. So really unfortunate. You see some pictures there of the soldiers on the left, and then on the right were pictures of the helots and all the support things that they would do to make sure these soldiers had what they needed to be able to fight. Number 19, Leonidas and his men used the phalanx formation, and you saw this a little bit in the video. The picture there on the top right of the phalanx with the spears out and the spears up. And then you see on the bottom right the phalanx when they put all the shields together. It became almost an impenetrable formation for anybody to try to attack. As king, Leonidas was a military leader as well as political one. Like all male Spartan citizens, Leonidas had been trained mentally and physically since childhood in preparation to become a hoplite warrior. Hoplites were armed with a round shield, spear, and iron short sword. In battle, they used a formation called the phalanx, in which rows of hoplites stood directly next to each other so that their shields overlapped with one another. During a frontal attack, this wall of shields provided significant protection to the warriors behind it. If the phalanx broke off or if the enemy attacked from the side or rear, however, the formation became vulnerable. It was this fatal weakness to the otherwise formidable phalanx formation that proved to be Leonidas's undoing against an invading Persian army at the Battle of Thermopylae, when Persians used the secret pass to surround the Spartans and Greeks. Their tactical advantage had been defeated. So pretty incredible. They had so much success with this formation, not only at this battle, but really all their battles. It was really incredibly hard to defeat, but as you saw, they were so outnumbered and eventually got surrounded. So we're not able to keep these formations together. Number 20, quotes in the 300 movie were accurate. You can see an epic picture there of Gerard Butler yelling one of these quotes as Leonidas. And then another picture you saw in the video there, some of the scenes from 300. There's a great scene there where the arrows are all flying down on these troops and they're looking at them like, what in the heck are we going to do now? Often, if they had enough men in the phalanx, they could resist these incredible volleys of arrows by putting their shields up and knocking them all off. Incredibly, 300 got a few quotes completely accurate about the Battle of Thermopylae, if the historical records can be trusted. King Leonidas allegedly did answer, "Come and get them," in response to Persian demands for Greeks' weapons. Likewise, both Plutarch and Herodotus claim an exchange happened where a joke was made about fighting in the shade while the Persian arrows blocked the sun itself. However, historians disagree on who said the punchline, with Herodotus crediting Spartan named Dionyscias and Plutarch claiming it was Leonidas who said it. But pretty interesting, they're using some of these historical quotes that were accurate and said at the time. Number 21, honoring King Leonidas. You heard in the video, it took the Greeks 40 years to bring Leonidas's bones back to Sparta. Soon after the Persians were finally driven out of Greece, however, the pass at Thermopylae was decorated with the stone lion in honor of the Spartan king. You see there on the top right, that was erected many, many years after the battle itself in honor of Leonidas. Second Persian invasion of Greece was only halted by the Greek naval victory at Salamis and the land victory at Plataea. The latter involved an army of Greeks led by the Spartan general and regent Pausanias, who took over from Leonidas after he was killed. See some epic battles there. See some epic battle pictures there on the bottom right, and then a part of the statue there in the center that is still on the site today. Number 22, not all Greeks retreated on day 3. Contrary to popular belief, the 300 Spartans were not alone on their final stand on day 3 of the battle. Over 700 soldiers from Thespia, their entire fighting force for their entire city, chose to stay behind with the Spartans, as did 400 men from Thebes. King Leonidas and the other Greeks were fully aware that the secret path which had led around the pass of Thermopylae, a local Greek named Heracles betrayed his countrymen by revealing a secret mountain path to the Persians for a monetary reward. This allowed them to flank the Spartan-led forces. Over 1,000 Phaeacians were stationed to guard the pass in case anyone happened to find it. And once the Persians found it, they pushed past the Phaeacians on the way around Spartans to encircle them with little resistance. You see a picture there of what some of the Greeks who supported the Spartans' shields looked like. So those would be the Thespians and the Thebans. And then you see a picture there of a picture actually today. This was taken in 2023 of that pass that goes around the cliffs, around to the other side that allowed the Persians to encircle and eventually kill the Greeks. Number 23, the fallen king. After the battle was finally won by the Persians and the remaining rear guard of the Greeks had been killed, many by archers, the leader of the Greek forces was given a particularly humiliating punishment by the Persians. And you heard a little bit about this in the video. Although Leonidas' body had been fought over by the surviving Greeks to protect it from desecration, the body of the Spartan king was beheaded and crucified. This went against the custom of the Persians, who normally treated their fallen enemies with honor. But Xerxes was feeling particularly vengeful after a week's delay and a particularly humiliating battle in which thousands of his men had died. You see some epic scenes from the movie there of Leonidas and his men. Number 24, the Spartan sacrifice still inspires. The sacrifice of the Spartans and their allies at Thermopylae became a rallying point for all of Greece. It galvanized the city-states to unite against the Persian threat. A monument at the site of Thermopylae bears the famous epitaph attributed to the poet Simonides. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. The battle's legacy was endured for millennia, inspiring countless works of art, literature, and film, and many sports teams all over the United States have now named themselves Spartans in honor of these fierce warriors. You can see a couple of logos there from some of the college football teams in the U.S. that have assumed the name Spartans. And then you can see the epitaph that's on site at Thermopylae that has that quote that I just read off about, go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient their laws, we lie. And you can also see another statue that was erected there for Leonidas and his men. Number 25, Leonidas and the 300 Spartans left a lasting mark on our culture. The story of Thermopylae has left a lasting mark on Western culture and military ethos. The concept of a last stand has become a powerful narrative in military history, often evoking the spirit of Thermopylae. The battle has been used as a moral lesson in courage, duty, and sacrifice, resonating across the generations. In modern times, the story of the 300 Spartans has been referenced in discussions of military strategy and leadership and team building, and is a rallying cry in all aspects of our society. You can see a couple of pictures there, the last stand of 300. You can see what one of the Spartan helmets would look like in that battle. Pretty incredible helmet there. And there's a picture there of the Greco-Persian Wars and the last stand of the 300. Some of the famous Leonidas quotes that came from the king: he who sweats more in training bleeds less in war. That's a really amazing quote, that the more prepared you are in your training, the better you're going to do in the competition. Good, then we shall have our battle in the shade. And of course, that was a famous quote that was true, that was made when he was threatened that they were going to be facing a lot of arrows coming from the archers of the Persians. And then there's a quote here, give them nothing but take from them everything. And that really was the attitude of Leonidas and his men, that they were going to last stand or they were going to take them out, one or the other. Another one there at the last meal on day 3. Remember this day, men, for it will be yours for all time. Another one, no retreat, no surrender. That is Spartan law. And by Spartan law, we will stand and fight and die. A new age has begun, an age of freedom, and all will know that the 300 Spartans gave their last breath to defend it. So pretty epic when you think about this last stand and what it means to our culture and to our ethos in terms of military and otherwise. The Spartans are the equal of any men when they fight as individuals. Fighting together as a collective, they surpass all other men. Another quote he said during that last meal, and you can see this if you watch the 300 movie, they do a really good job in that last meal. He says, "Tonight we will dine in hell." Next one he said, "The walls of Sparta were its young men and its borders the points of their spears." And then the last one, "Come and take them," as we talked about. That was his response back to Xerxes, who was asking him to hand over his weapons. So some pretty incredible quotes here, and you can see why Leonidas and the Spartan 300 are studied by military strategists and schools all over the world and have been over the millennia. Hopefully you enjoyed that and you learned a lot about King Leonidas I and the Spartan 300 and the other Greeks who stood behind them and what happened on that day in Thermopylae, what happened during his rule, and really the ethos and the military mentality of the Spartans were really fascinating. The history is incredible. Of course, this was the second time the Persians had incurred into Greece, and this was the Greeks, in their opinion, kind of their last stand. And it was really important that they slowed them down that week and were giving the rest of the city-states time to organize and to get themselves together for the war that was coming. So really interesting stuff there, and a lot of great facts there that I was able to pull together in my research, and have always been fascinated about this topic. I was really excited to bring it to you today. Hope you learned a lot and that you want to dig some more into Leonidas and the Spartans, and that you'll want to check out the movie 300 with Gerard Butler. It's a really excellent movie, especially if you love war movies. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We have a lot of great programs coming your way, and there's just so much good stuff to talk about. And drop us a comment down below on something you want us to do in the future, maybe a topic that we haven't covered yet on this channel. We hope you love history as much as we do, and hope you have a great evening. Thank you so much.